Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's safeguarding update for independent schools. We are absolutely delighted to have so many of you with us today and hope that the start of your new academic years has gone well, is going well, and that today will be a useful opportunity for you to reflect on your school's safeguarding arrangements. This morning, we're going to be covering. Yvonne's going to start us off with an introduction and background to the Everyone's Invited movement, Ofsted review, and the changes we've all seen to keeping children safe in education. And then with routine inspections having restarted, I'm going to pick up on some of the changes in expectation of governors and proprietors in safeguarding governance terms. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Yvonne, who's going to make a start. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Tabitha, and good morning to you all. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with this first section of the agenda, which is focusing on the recent developments. And if we look at the next slide, please, we're going to start with an overview of Everyone's Invited. Lots of publicity about it over the summer and, in fact, in the run-up to this. But essentially, so that everyone's aware, it was self-described as a movement, and the timing of it was such that it followed on the heels of Black Lives Matter. And it was staged on Instagram and supported by a website, and it was founded in June 2020. And essentially, this led to the publication of thousands of testimonials of sexual harassment and violence. And it brought safeguarding in schools into really sharp focus. And I don't know if anyone looked at it, but on the submission form, anonymous testimonies gave the individuals the opportunity to specify names, schools, universities, and other organisations that were linked to their testimony. And it is possible to download a list of the schools that were mentioned by those victims on the website. So, as you may imagine, traction from this movement gathered apace, and it became quite clear that despite the best efforts of educationists and a developed regulatory framework for safeguarding English schools, something wasn't working. And so, on the 31st of March this year, Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, announced two immediate measures to address the issues that were identified through the Everyone's Invited. Now, the first of these was an NSPCC helpline, which it went live from the 1st of April to support potential victims of sexual harassment and abuse in education settings. And its aim is to provide both children and adults who are the victims of sexual abuse with the appropriate support and advice that they need, including on how to contact the police. Now, the second and important thing that was announced was the government asked Ofsted to undertake an immediate review of safeguarding policies in schools and colleges in relation to sexual abuse. Next slide, please. So in terms of the terms of reference, first of all, the request was that Ofsted would look at safeguarding and the curriculum. So the question was for Ofsted, is the existing safeguarding framework and guidance for inspectors robust enough to properly access how schools and colleges safeguard and promote the welfare of children? And how can schools and colleges be supported further to successfully deliver the new RSHE curriculum, including teaching about sexual abuse, cyberbullying and pornography, as well as healthy relationships and consent? The second item was around multi-agency arrangements, and really to look at how well they were working, how well the guidance and processes were understood and implemented, both between schools and colleges and the local multi-agency partners. And it also looked at the question of whether, in fact, those arrangements need to be strengthened. Next slide, please. And then the next item was in relation to victims' voice and reporting, obviously a really important part of this terms of reference. So the question was, how does the current system of safeguarding schools and colleges listen to the voices of children when reporting sexual abuse, and whether this occurs inside or outside of schools? And really also to look at what prevents children from coming forward and reporting sexual abuse. And then also looking at how well supported those victims are, and to look at the important question of whether inspections by both ISI and Ofsted have been robust enough in order to deal with the issues that were raised. Next slide, please. So in terms of the findings then, things went ahead promptly and Ofsted carried out their review. And Ofsted published its review on the 10th of June, following visits to 32 state-funded and independent schools and discussions with more than 900 pupils about the prevalence of sexual harassment in their lives. Ofsted also spoke to school leaders, staff, safeguarding partners, stakeholders and parents, and reviewed the extent to which these issues are addressed during inspection. Now, Ofsted did make a number of visits to schools, but didn't actually report on individual schools, and the cases remained anonymous, albeit in a very small number of cases, the visits did precipitate inspections by Ofsted. They did not, Ofsted did not analyse the question of whether the issue was more prevalent in the independent or state funding sector or between different groups of young people, but in fact found that the issue is so widespread that it needs addressing by schools and multi-agency partners alike, regardless of which part of the sector the school operates. And then in relation to the key findings, the first thing is that they found that people don't report harmful behaviour because they see it as part of their normal experience. And adults are viewed by those children and young people as not really understanding the reality of their lives. Ofsted also found that teachers and leaders underestimate the scale of the problem and in some cases are unaware that it's happening. Some staff, they said, are unable to identify sexual harassment, sexual violence and sexualized language as being significant problems. And even where there's a proactive whole school approach to tackling these issues, professionals, Ofsted found, consistently underestimate the prevalence of online sexual abuse. And then pupils are reluctant to talk to teachers for many reasons, including fear of reputational damage, being socially ostracised, and worry about the processes and the potential for police involvement. Ofsted also found that schools are left to navigate grey areas, and I think anyone who's been involved in an incident would have a real insight to that. And so without sufficient guidance, it's particularly difficult when criminal investigations do not lead to a prosecution or conviction, and then it's really about how schools and the other agencies deal with it in those circumstances. Ofsted also made the key finding that the new relationships, sex and health education curriculum doesn't give pupils the information they need, with no clear content relating to acceptable and unacceptable behaviours. And importantly, Ofsted remarked that there's a widespread lack of teacher knowledge on topics relating to consent, healthy relationships and the sharing of images. and insufficient time has been given to the new topics, and curricular planning is poor. And the last point just there is that the effective joint working was not happening consistently across the different areas, or that was the other finding. And so, as a result of all of those, what did Ofsted recommend for schools and partner agencies? Next slide, please. Well, they said that there should be, that even where there's no specific information that indicates sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are problems for pupils, leaders should act on the assumption that they are happening. They also said that there needed to be development of a culture where all kinds of sexual harassment are recognised and addressed where sanctions are appropriate. And that's something that certainly we've done a lot of thinking about, and it's really important that this emanates from the top. There was also the requirement to have carefully sequenced RSHE and high quality training for teachers delivering this, and with sufficient time to be allocated for topics that pupils find difficult, such as consent and explicit sharing of images. And inevitably, and the precursor to all of that has to be high quality specific training for those teachers who are tasked with delivering this. And the need for training for staff and for governors to enable them to better understand definitions of sexual harassment and sexual violence, including online sexual abuse, and to identify early signs of peer-on-peer sexual abuse and consistently uphold standards in their responses. And then the other thing to note was that schools should routinely keep records of sexual harassment and sexual violence, including online, and analyse these to identify patterns and intervene early to prevent abuse. So really important point there about reviewing the information, analysing it, and then taking proactive steps to address areas, whether, to identify particular, it might be a geographical area or particular times or particular groups, just to address those emerging patterns. And the other things that they recommended was improved engagement between multi-agency safeguarding partners, to ensure that schools are aware of the support available to victims and alleged perpetrators in their areas, and to have dedicated time so that the DSL can actually engage with these local partners to ensure that the proper support mechanisms are put in place. So next slide, please. So taking all of those things, it's inevitable that those key findings and recommendations have now worked their way into the updated version of Keeping Children Safe in Education. Now, this came into effect on the 1st of September, and so this now should be integral to all of your safeguarding policies. And I'm going to run through now with you what those main changes are. This isn't in the time available an absolute verbatim list of everything, but some really key points addressing the terms of reference, key findings, just so that we're all clear on how it all threads through. What I would say is that when you go into Keeping Children Safe, KICSI, you will see that there is an Annex G to this document, which does in fact have a table of all of the changes. So that's a really helpful point, starting point for you there. So just looking at the part one then with you, is just a few points. So inevitably, an increased focus on peer abuse appears in part 1, and in fact throughout the document, with schools being reminded that even if there are no reports of peer-on-peer abuse, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So you essentially turn it on its head and assume that it is. And the guidance reminds us that all forms of peer-on-peer abuse are unacceptable, not just sexual violence and sexual harassment, which are dealt with in part 4, which we'll come on to. Misogyny is expressly referred to in part 1 for the first time in this context. So you can see how the prominence this is given and the mandatory elements and how they're coming through. Staff have long been required to know what to do if a child tells them that they are being abused or neglected, but now staff are required expressly to reassure those reporting that they are being taken seriously. And that's in direct response to Ofsted looking at the barriers. So inevitably, the DfE expects schools to make all of their staff aware of how to deal with peer-on-peer abuse, the whole school approach, which should be reflected in the child protection policy, as should the approach to children who are reporting abuse, and the need to reassure them. In essence, no victim should be ashamed of making a report. There's also the big focus on technology and abuse, and absolute recognition that technology can be a significant component in safeguarding and well-being issues. We all know that children abuse their peers online. It can be abusive, harassing, misogynistic, and it can sometimes be hidden. And again, with the technology aspects of this, just because people aren't reporting it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So all staff needs to be vigilant and report any concerns. And of course, this can happen outside of school, as with all forms of abuse. And schools should protect a child who's been harmed or is at risk of harm wherever that abuse takes place. And obviously, if staff have got concerns, they speak to the DSL. The next slide is looking at the management of safeguarding, which is in part 2 of KICSI. And there is an increased focus on safeguarding the culture, not formally defined in this guidance, but we consider it to be one where people identify concerns and report them, confident that appropriate action will be taken. So at every level, governors, leaders and staff should be actively addressing and challenging inappropriate language and attitudes in school, which could lead to a culture of unacceptable behaviours, an unsafe environment for, and in worst case scenarios, a culture that normalises abuse, leading to children accepting it as normal and not coming forward to report it. In terms of the management of safeguarding, again, following through, increased focus on online safety, with tailored approaches to teaching children to keep safe, and an annual review of the school's arrangements being recommended. And one of the things that you will see in the KICSI is this guidance classifies risks relating to online safety, and it's coined as the 4, there were previously 3, C's, and that is content, conduct, and commerce. And in relation to looking at information safety and access arrangements, when you look at paragraphs 131 to 134, you will see that in relation to carrying out the annual review of the school's approach to online safety, there are links in there to toolkits which can assist with this process also. Next slide, please. So part 3 of KICSI is the safer recruitment section. And I think to say here that there've been no changes to the statutory requirements, but there has been a substantive restructuring of this section of the guidance, and more detail is provided around the expectations of schools, although the underlying legal obligations for the most part remain unchanged. And what the DfE wants is schools to have clear safeguarding recruitment processes in place which demonstrate the commitment to safeguarding and which deter and prevent unsuitable people from giving the opportunity to work with children. So key changes included in that section is, you'll see on the slide there, to be aware of people changing their names, check from birth certificates where possible. There is reference to the declaration form and a number of other things there, which are all detailed in the guidance. So I won't expand on those now in the time we have available. The next part of KICSI that we are looking at is part 4, which is the section which deals with allegations and concerns about staff. Now, the most significant change here is that schools which do not already have a clear policy for the management of low-level concerns about staff is the requirement to introduce one. Now, this need not be a standalone document, but as long as there is an approach to capture concerns about any adult working in or on behalf of a school where they behave in such a way which is inconsistent with the school's code of conduct or otherwise behave in a way which causes concerns, even if they don't meet the harms threshold for the referral of the allegation to a local authority. And essentially what it's designed to do is to capture any concern, no matter how small, because there may be evidence of the start of a slippery slope of misconduct. And this slippery slope of misconduct is a theory that was espoused by the safeguarding expert Margus Aruga when he gave evidence to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And such examples would include for staff being over-friendly with children, things like having favourites, taking photographs of children on their mobile phones, engaging with children on a one-to-one basis. And the part 4 also talks about having these reports being shared responsibly and being recorded and dealt with appropriately. And they should be generally be discussed with the person raising this concern, the person about whom it was raised, and any witnesses to, in order to determine what further action is warranted and help to clarify professional boundaries. Staff should also have a facility to self-report, and schools should consider how and how long to store any such records. And there's an argument that those records should be retained indefinitely. Other changes include the fact that contractors and governors are now expressly included in part 4, and schools should ensure that allegations and concerns about them are dealt with properly. Next slide, please. So the next section where there have been changes in KICSI is in part 5, which is the section on child sexual violence and sexual harassment. And it is itself simply a summary of the updated non-statutory sexual violence and sexual harassment between children in schools and colleges guidance, which is essential reading, and actually we would say should be used alongside part 5. And it's now clear that the DfE expects findings to be made where possible on peer allegations, using the same categories as those that apply to staff, namely that allegations are substantiated, unsubstantiated, unfounded, false and malicious, and appropriate action to be taken, seemingly using the slippery slope analogy referred to in relation to staff, in that it states that addressing inappropriate behaviour, even if it appears to be relatively innocuous, can be an important intervention that helps prevent problematic, abusive and/or violent behaviour in the future. So other things there that just to bring out from the slide, obviously responding to all reports, recognition that girls are more likely to be victims than boys, really understand, acknowledge it at the scale of it, and have a zero tolerance to sexual violence and sexual harassment, so that there is a real calling out. And just for your reference, those sections that I've talked about on this slide about dealing with unsubstantiated, unfounded, false or malicious reports can be found in paragraphs 453 to 454 of the guidance. So I really do commend that section to you. It's not only is it essential, but it's a very helpful working document also. Next slide, please. So I've just covered a lot of detail from the various parts of keeping children safe in education. And of course, it is a requirement that there is ongoing training for all staff. And to help you with this task, we have, through our e-learning modules, updated our content, and we are able to offer this to you, offering short 30-minute tailored courses. So the first one of those e-learning courses is on part 1, which is for staff working directly with children. There's also a course on Annex A. Annex A is the part of KICSI which is for those who don't work directly with children. So a slightly different version, because clearly the issues are slightly different if you're on the front line or staff are not in those roles. And then a training course on part 2, which is a course to help governors with the management of safeguarding. And I know if anyone would like to have a demonstration of those, we will be pleased to arrange those for you. Thank you. Next slide. So that is all of the content now that I'm going to cover on KICSI. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other recent updates that have happened. So next slide, please. So the first of these is the government's Tackling Child Abuse Strategy. And this was, it was published in January, and it was in fact updated in June. And the strategy references working together, definition of child sexual abuse, and focuses on crime and justice with additional references to wider community and to education. And interestingly, also the independent inquiry into child sexual abuses interim reports have also formed part of this strategy. And essentially, the strategy promotes an overarching whole system approach framework based on the 4 Ps, which are pursue, prepare, protect, and prevent. And this is underpinned by 4 core principles. The first of these, that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility and everyone has a role in preventing child sexual abuse. That there is the need to work across agencies and systems to uncover and respond to child sexual abuse. And we need a collaborative response which empowers local partners to respond to local issues. And then finally, tackling child sexual abuse is a global issue. And this strategy sets a series of objectives, including a fundamental one to protect and safeguard young people and children and support all victims and survivors. And in this context, the government has identified a need for teachers to be better informed and education settings to be better equipped to identify CSA and the risks associated with harmful sexual behaviour, sharing of nude and semi-nude images, and peer-on-peer abuse. That we expect that to be for further consultation to go on that. So really important to be aware of that and the overarching elements and how schools fit into all of this. Next slide. So the other development to make you aware of is the revised Victims Code. And this was published this time by the Ministry of Justice. It was published actually in 2020. And the government has also pledged more support for victims and survivors of child sexual abuse and to boost investment in specialist support service. So the revised Victims Code sets out the services and minimum standards that must be provided to victims of crimes. And all victims have specific rights that they need to be able to understand, and those working with them need to have understood. So all schools should ensure that their own processes mirror these rights. And the code also sets out another 9 additional rights to victims who have reported a crime to the police. Next slide, please. So just distilling down all of those developments and changes, we're going to look in this section of our session this morning at recommended actions for schools. Next slide, please. So in relation to the recommended actions, schools must ensure that all staff are familiar with KICSI as follows. So staff working directly with children should read and understand Part 1 of KICSI as a minimum. Other staff at the school's discretion read Annex 1 instead of Part 1. All SLT members are expected to read the entire guidance, and governors should read and understand Part 2 as a minimum. In terms of training, the training of staff, as we've said, all staff should be trained to manage a report to ensure that it's effective and they are confident about how to manage disclosures effectively. It needs to take account of any updated local safeguarding partner advice. And there needs to be arrangements in place to hear the pupil voice. In terms of that listening to the pupil voice, particularly given everything that's come through from Ofsted, the findings, the changes, schools need to be clear about the arrangements that they are putting in place, including reporting of concerns, consultation groups, anonymous routes, both internal and external. I know different software is being used to capture that information, but also thinking about whether schools have searched social media campaigns to see if any of their pupils have contributed, what they've done, and how schools have sought to engage with the issues. So other recommended action then is in relation to the child protection and safeguarding policies, as well as a number of others. And you'll see on this slide that we've produced a list of policies that will need to be reviewed, if not done so, if you haven't done so already. So child protection, safeguarding, online safety and acceptable use, if that's a standalone one. The anti-bullying and behaviour and discipline policies to include measures to prevent bullying, including cyberbullying, prejudice-based and discriminatory bullying, and updated content on peer and peer abuse. Special educational needs and disabilities policy features there. Consider pupils with certain health, including physical health conditions, and also think about the impact of mental health and well-being in relation to these types of abuse, but possibly also think about it in the context of how children's mental health may or may not have been affected by the pandemic and lockdowns. Other things to think about, we've said already, the low-level concerns policy. It doesn't need to be a standalone policy, as I've said already, and then other policies to look at include the staff code of conduct. Next slide, please. The next area of recommended action is in relation to the technical and organisational measures. And schools must ensure that they have appropriate technical, including network security, and training and policies in place to keep information secure. And there is a requirement under the UK GDPR and the new section on information security, which simply reiterates that what you should be doing already. Obviously, review data protection procedures and policies regularly to check that they are effective at keeping personal data secure. And obviously, child protection information must be subject to robust security measures, including access permissions. Next slide, please. Just to make, before I just talk about safer recruitment, just to go back on technical and organisational for a moment. The other thing is that just to pull through here is that KICSI really does stress that good record keeping is also essential for data protection compliance. So you'll know already that it's a principle of UK GDPR that personal data is accurate and kept up to date already, but record keeping really, really important. And we did see from some of the reviews where Ofsted visited as part of the Everyone's Invited review, there was very thorough look at record keeping in relation to incidents. So in relation to safe recruitment, I just wanted to add there that schools should also review and revise their hire agreements to ensure appropriate arrangements are in place to keep children safe. Schools should also review their recruitment procedures and how they handle allegations, ensure current practice follows a logical format and is consistent with the approach taken in parts 3 and parts 4 of KICSI. And certainly at VWV, we have revised our safer recruitment resources, training and employment handbooks also to reflect these changes. In relation to review, do review historic reports of child sexual abuse, sexual violence and sexual harassment to identify trends and to consider, for example, whether there might be geographical areas of concern on the school site, which could perhaps be addressed by increasing lighting or supervision or the implementation of designated places of safety. You'll also need to be looking at your RSE policy and curricular content. And you will know that the requirement to teach at secondary level became mandatory in September 2020, but schools were given flexibility to push back at the implementation until the start of summer 21 due to the disruption caused by the pandemic. So obviously this is now live and the content will come under close scrutiny. So because of where we are, it may be appropriate to plan further consultations with parents and pupils in light of this and the national dialogue about age-appropriate content. In particular, schools should ensure there is adequate content on healthy sexual relationships, mutual respect, sexual consent, and its withdrawal, personal privacy, pornography, and gender stereotypes. And then, of course, recommended action, the school safeguarding culture. How is this established and measured? Is it is inappropriate behaviour being challenged, called out, action taken? Okay, thank you. So those are the remaining thoughts from me at this stage. And now I'm going to hand you over to Tabitha Cave to look at safeguarding governance.
Thanks, Yvonne. And I really do want to pick up in a bit more detail what Yvonne has just said about a school's safeguarding culture. What we're seeing through all of the guidance that's been issued and updated is increasing focus on culture without any actual definition of what we mean by it. Essentially, I think culture really distills down to how things are done here. And when people talk about an organisational safeguarding culture, they're talking about a number of different aspects. They're talking about the provision of a safe, protective and inclusive environment, one where people are encouraged to come forward and disclose any concerns they may have, safe in the knowledge that they will be handled properly, that they'll be handled sensitively, confidentially where possible, and appropriately. And there's this increased expectation that if somebody raises allegations or concerns, that they will be supported to do so, rather than treated as someone who is creating a problem for the organisation. Victims must be supported, and others who are aligned to victims must be supported. Everyone involved needs and thought. And of course, not only is safeguarding about looking after those people who have been harmed or may have been harmed, but it's also about taking action as appropriate against those who have caused harm. And what we've seen through the changes to KCSIE is that real lowering of a threshold in terms of addressing concerns, nipping things in the bud, stopping the slippery slope. And making sure that there is an environment where these things are challenged, but challenged not as part of a witch hunt or part of an overly aggressive and critical regime, but as part of setting a culture of acceptable behaviour within the organisation. And the other key cultural point, I think, relates to a willingness to reflect and improve, and that continual improvement process that we need as new issues come to light, or as our own policies and procedures are assessed with reference to new issues in terms of how appropriate they may be. So if we move on to the next slide, what I wanted to consider is, alongside what we've talked about with keeping children safe, about the changes that are required in school, is also to think about the proprietor duties. So normally those on a board of governors in an independent school, but of course not exclusively. So governors are the ones who have the strategic leadership responsibility, and there are a number of ways in which that can be done. Starting at the top, I think, with vision, values, ethos, aims, and it can be helpful sometimes to codify the school's expectations in relation to safeguarding in those contexts. Governors, of course, are responsible for compliance. That's what we get through keeping children safe, and actually what we get in the underlying law. It's sometimes helpful just to take stock of where we are with the law. So schools are required to comply with education law, and for the purposes of this morning, the principal legislation will be the independent school standards, which haven't changed, but what they have done is require compliance with statutory guidance, which in particular in relation to keeping children safe. We also have, for those of you who have boarders, the national minimum standards for boarding. We know they're about to be updated. It's been heralded for some time. The latest we've heard is that that is likely to be changed in February and out for consultation next month, but that's not guaranteed. And for those of you who have children, young children, as part of the early years foundation stage, we've just had an update, albeit no significant updates in relation to safeguarding. Because many of you will be charities and subject to charity law, it's important that you also think about how the changes we've talked about already complement the existing obligations under charity law. So a charitable school's obligations are set out in the Safeguarding and Protecting People guidance, and that hasn't been updated since October 2019. But it sets this wider duty on charities to ensure that charitable schools take reasonable steps to protect everyone who comes into contact with the charity from harm. So that's not just about the protection of children, but the protection of everyone. And harm is similarly widely drafted. The Commission actually sets out a number of examples of harm, which includes things like bullying, discrimination, data breaches, poor behaviour and poor accountability within its remit. So a school will need to make sure, and the proprietor will need to make sure, that those additional duties are covered off, whether through the safeguarding framework that they've set up for the protection of children or separately. And governors are expected, as I said, to champion safeguarding and set and live the school's culture that we've talked about and expected standards. And it can be very difficult to know how you measure a school's culture. Most schools will have some KPIs that they can use for that, and some will think about using external tools or resources to do so. So for those of you who are looking at how you might measure or audit the school's culture, it may be helpful for you to look at the Charity Governance Code, which is endorsed by the Charity Commission, and talks in particular about principles and integrity and openness and accountability, which is a real theme we're seeing in relation to safeguarding. Or Bond's safeguarding tool. It's a leadership tool, which is a discussion framework about developing and modelling a positive safeguarding culture. And I can send links to both of those with the follow-up to this webinar. Governors, of course, or proprietors are required to ensure that there is sufficient resource for safeguarding. And yes, that is pound, shillings and pence, but it's also capacity of those who lead on safeguarding within the school to address the issues that they are required to do. And particularly thinking about the capacity of your designated safeguarding lead and their team in leading safeguarding within the school. And as Yvonne mentioned, there's a requirement to conduct an annual review of safeguarding. And what KCSIE now says, that there does also need to be a review of online safety, which can be done alongside the review of safeguarding or separately. And what we're really seeing now is an increased focus on the adequacy of an annual review of safeguarding, not just to check whether the policies and procedures are appropriate and compliant, but whether they're followed in practice and whether they're effective in practice. We are seeing much more appetite from regulators, whether the Commission or inspectors, to actually ask to see the documentation linked to the annual review of safeguarding to explore whether this is being done effectively. And if we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. Just following on what Yvonne has already spoken about in terms of implementing part 2 in particular. Yes, of course, there's a requirement to have the board level or equivalent lead, the proprietor lead on safeguarding, but also the appropriate person or people from the SLT. And making sure in terms of themes that there really is this whole school approach to safeguarding, where safeguarding is considered as part of any policy and procedure and training and its effectiveness, and where children's wishes and feelings are taken into account at every stage. So one of the things that I think is important for proprietors to take away is this real duty that's moved from checking that policies and procedures are compliant and signing off on a policy to making sure that we go beyond that, to making sure it's followed in practice and that people have the training and the skills to understand the significance of what they're being asked to do and make sure that it's being managed properly. One of the things that Yvonne talked about was the need to ensure that a school properly contributes to multi-agency working. That, of course, is set out in working together to safeguard children. But one of the things that Ofsted identified was that some schools, and in particular independent schools, don't contribute effectively and don't collaborate enough. So do think about how you might measure that. Think about your school's role, whether you're a relevant agency within the local safeguarding partnership, and whether actually the local authority is satisfied that the school's thresholds and ability to fit with the local safeguarding partners' objectives is working effectively. And if you could move on to the next slide, please. One of the aspects that I think is particularly important when it comes to safeguarding governance is really understanding your delegation arrangements and being able to demonstrate that to regulators or people who may look in. We know, I think it's now well established, that responsibility remains with the proprietor and normally the Board of Governors. But they will ordinarily have delegation arrangements through governance committee structures. Most schools now are looking to make sure they have a committee which covers safeguarding, not just at a pupil level, but the broader charitable piece, and actually a committee with safeguarding in its name to demonstrate its primacy. So think about whether you have a documented scheme of delegation at governance level, and then how that sits and works with the delegation arrangements within the school. And I think it can be helpful to document those either in your policy, and certainly from our template point of view, we're looking to signpost that more in the interests of openness and transparency now for all stakeholders to see, and make sure that there's real clarity of roles and responsibilities. People know what they're being asked to do, they have the skills to do it, and they have appropriate training for it. And it's not just a tick box of have you been on a webinar, for example, but really a need to think about whether the training is appropriate and enables people to perform their role. And I've talked about the need to ensure the charitable safeguarding duty is addressed, because some schools which are charitable will still be using local authority policies in relation to the protection of children, which won't themselves cover off the broader duty, which needs to be picked up in some format. And if we then move on to the next slide, let's just think about preparation for inspections. Routine inspections have restarted this term, and we've already seen much more focus, as you'd expect, on peer abuse, following what we've seen, on inclusivity and on safeguarding cultures. So organisations need to be ready to deal with those and to think about the metrics and the story, the narrative that they can share with inspectors in that context. For those of you who don't know, we had a new ISI commentary that was published on the 28th of September, and as is usual when ISI update their handbook, they have flagged the changes with the bold line down the left-hand margin so that you can see what's there. There is very much more focus on cultures and a lot more content extrapolated from keeping children safe to make sure that it's picked up within the inspection framework. So I think it is almost unavoidable that any routine inspection will not cover off the school's assessment of its safeguarding culture and how it is dealing with peer-on-peer aspects, and a real focus to arrangements for the support of mental health of all stakeholders, but in particular pupils, with what we are seeing. And do please bear in mind that Part 8 of the Independent School Standards, which looks at leadership and management, not just on a proprietor basis, but the leadership and management of a school in practice, talks about the demonstration of good skills and knowledge to ensure that the standards are met and met consistently. And the test that's made in relation to Part 8 is actually about outcomes. So that there is this real marked interplay between the other standards and the Part 8 leadership standard, and governors will be expected to talk to the arrangements for compliance across the independent school standards and the framework, and asked to, as part of that, actively promote the well-being of pupils. Well-being is, of course, more than just protecting people from harm, but it's a much more positive agenda which goes beyond supporting health of pupils in particular and protecting them from harm and neglect, to thinking about the arrangements for their education and training and recreation, and more broadly to their contribution to society, picking up this this piece on cultures that we've talked about. Now, one of the changes that we saw when we were had the last set of guidance from the DFE on the independent school standards was the need to ensure that concerns are addressed properly, and this real need to establish that all concerns are taken seriously, and that you are, as a school, inviting people to give feedback and making sure that through that process you're actively engaging with your stakeholders and addressing issues that are raised. So I think you can expect to have some questioning about how it is you engage with people, whether it is pupils to ensure that children's wishes and feelings are taken into account, staff in relation to the development of the school's systems and policies and procedures, but also any stakeholders that real wish to engage with them for that continual improvement process that we talked about. And as part of that, there's this real need to ensure that systems are well promoted, easily understood and accessible to everyone. Coming back to the piece that we were talking about the charitable safeguarding duty, and indeed the victims code that Yvonne mentioned. So if we move on to the next slide, what I've done is address some questions that it may be helpful for your school to consider in advance of an inspection, or as part of an annual review of safeguarding, or as part of your governor training, so that you can make sure that you are addressing the sort of questions that the school's regulators will ask you to consider. And rather than read those questions out, I will leave you to review them yourselves. But one of the things that may be helpful is for governors and school leaders, in particular for chairs and nominated safeguarding governors. We're running an in-person course in our London office on the 19th of October to explore the governance issues, safeguarding governance issues in a bit more detail. And within that, we will be covering assessment of safeguarding cultures and the proper conduct of an annual review of safeguarding, given the focus that is being placed on those. So in terms of today's session, those were the issues that we wanted to talk about in relation to changes and developments we've seen over the course of the last year or so. We do have a little bit of time for questions. I'm conscious we've gone over the hour, but if anybody has some questions, we can address those now. Or otherwise, we'll be pleased to get back to people afterwards. So one of the questions that we have received was about terms of reference for a safeguarding committee. And yes, we do have suggestions on that, although it does vary by organisation. And indeed, that's one of the things that we will be picking up as part of the effective safeguarding governance training that we're doing, and the effective safeguarding governance pack that we offer to independent schools. So I'll pick those up separately.